One day in January of 2018, a police officer was making his way through a quiet patch of woods near the small town of Gray in France. And as he walked, his eyes were fixed on the ground because he was following a literal trail of blood. This trail eventually led the officer to the body of a person who had very clearly been shot in the head. Now, at first glance, this had all the markings of a suicide, but the officer had some serious questions. This was not the first body that had been found in these same woods. Another one had been discovered just a couple of months earlier, and it was starting to feel like there was a very disturbing pattern forming here. At around 5 in the evening on the 27th of October 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval was driving her car down a cul-de-sac in that same small, quiet town of Gray. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's second birthday. It was supposed to be a big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had all driven in from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away, just for this celebration. But as Alexia drove, she had to admit to herself that she had very mixed feelings about seeing everyone tonight. You see, Alexia had been going through a really difficult time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant for a while. She had gone through several rounds of fertility treatments, and the process had thrown her hormones completely out of whack. It seemed to affect her a lot more intensely than it did for most women who went through it. And then, after all of that struggle, she had finally gotten pregnant. But just a couple of months ago, she had tragically suffered a miscarriage. So, even though Alexia absolutely adored her sister's family and got along with them wonderfully, the pain of her miscarriage was still very raw. She just knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for her to be around her young nephew. He was a constant, innocent reminder of the baby she had lost. Alexia's car came to a stop outside a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac. She pushed the button on the intercom, and a moment later, the gate swung open. She drove up the long driveway toward a beautiful house with a perfectly kept garden out front. She parked her car in the driveway, right behind her father's white van, and then she got out. She reached into the back seat and grabbed a wrapped present along with a couple of desserts she baked herself. She carried them up to the front door of the house and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened, and her mother, Isabelle Fouillot, stood there with a huge smile on her face. She welcomed Alexia inside and led her into the dining room. Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, was sitting at the table, deep in conversation with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and greeted her with warm hugs. As Alexia started to explain that her husband, Jonathan, was running late and would be there later in a separate car because a job he was on as an electrician had run long, she heard the sound of little feet pattering towards her. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his little arms around Alexia's legs. To her own surprise and immense relief, Alexia didn't feel that familiar pang of sadness. All she felt was a wave of pure happiness. She bent down and scooped the little boy up into her arms, giving him a big, warm hug. Then she handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the whole family settled in for dinner. And for a while, all of Alexia's worries and sadness just seemed to melt away. She was incredibly close with everyone at that table, especially her mother and her sister, Stephanie. Just being around them always had a way of lifting her spirits. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30 that evening. He joined the family, and along with everyone else, he had a wonderful night. They ate, they drank, and they just chatted and laughed together. After dinner was all cleaned up, Alexia's father decided to head to bed, but everyone else stayed up. They all just continued to have this really nice, comfortable time together until around 11 o'clock when Alexia announced that it was probably time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in before starting her day. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She had left her own car back at her parents' house because she had been drinking wine with dinner, and she was planning to just pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was located on a quiet residential street only about a mile away from her parents' place. And as they drove down their road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, her expression soured. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer long. He had become obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't even feel safe going out for a jog by herself around their own neighborhood. Fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't know how long he would be there. She didn't know if he had already been released. So it felt more like a temporary pause than a real, long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. As Alexia walked from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill that sat in the corner of the garage. It had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he told her no, he hadn't. Alexia just sighed. The weather forecast for the next day was supposed to be very cold and gloomy. It looked like she was going to have to go for her run outside after all. The following morning, around 11 o'clock, Jonathan walked up to the front door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. As he waited, he cast a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked right where they had left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried to hide how anxious he was feeling as Alexia's mother, Isabel, answered the door. Then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she had seen or heard from her daughter recently. When Isabel said she hadn't, Jonathan completely lost his composure. He told her that Alexia had gone out for a jog that morning, but she hadn't come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he had tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered. By this point, she should have been home a long, long time ago. Something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room. They had very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what all the commotion was about. So, Jonathan frantically re-explained the situation. He asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so, but they both shook their heads and said they hadn't. Stephanie did show Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning, just saying that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from her. Jonathan was openly crying by this point. Alexia's family tried to assure him that everything was probably fine. They told him Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute now, that she was likely just running late. Jonathan wanted to believe them, but this was completely out of character for Alexia. It was not normal for her to be gone for this long without being in touch with anyone. It just didn't make any sense. It was at this point that his brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put a comforting hand on Jonathan's shoulder. He just said, "Look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you. We can go look for Alexia together, or at least we can be together until she comes back." Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful for the offer and said yes, that would be great. A couple of minutes later, the two men got into Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan had Gregory drive through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could spot her. They drove down all the side streets, scanning for any sign of her. When they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and started checking the paths that led into the countryside. They also checked the ditches and the banks of the nearby river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. Eventually, they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house, hoping that maybe she had finally come home with an explanation for all of this. But she hadn't. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself with worry. Gregory, doing his best to stay calm for both of them, suggested that they go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there. A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance. Two nurses were standing outside taking a cigarette break. Jonathan rushed up to them and told them that he was looking for his wife, that she had gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now, and maybe, just maybe, she was here. The nurses could clearly see this was an emergency. They put out their cigarettes and went back inside to check the hospital's register. But a minute later, they came back out and told the men that no, and Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She wasn't there. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just looked at them and said, "Look, you need to go to the police." Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline Pegney sat across from Jonathan in a small room at the Gray police station. He explained to her what had happened, that his wife was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running: bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket. It would have been pretty easy to spot. And then, after describing her and sort of realizing the full weight of why he was there, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, just as he had been doing for much of the morning. Now, Officer Pegney could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason at all she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head, no. He said that overall his wife was a very happy person and was definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he added that she had been taking hormones for her fertility treatments, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, he said that sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. In other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses where she wouldn't even know what she was doing while she was doing it. It was like she had become this completely different person. Officer Pegney nodded and just listened to Jonathan, writing down everything he was saying. When he was done, she followed up and asked, "Can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia?" For a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly, his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told the officer that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arno, and he had been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number. She had even talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back, and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. Officer Pegney was obviously very intrigued by this information. So, after this interview with Jonathan was over, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arno guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly they discovered that while Arno had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true. He was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Gray Police knocked on the door of Arno's mother's house, where Arno was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. When the officer asked if she was Arno's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see a disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. He asked the mother if that was Arno, and again the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arno in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute they both agreed and the officer came inside. The officer went into the house and sat down in the living room with Arno, while Arno's mother went to the kitchen to give them some privacy. Once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arno and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duvall. Arno immediately looked down at this question like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder. He explained that sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, and that included Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that Arno had apparently sent to Alexia that summer. What was going on with that? Arno admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point and they had also hung out in a group setting once. So him being in touch with her was not totally weird, he claimed. They had a real connection. But Arno clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did. And that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arno's phone number. So, the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arno that Alexia was missing. And then, before Arno could say anything, the officer asked him where he had been that morning at 9 o'clock. And Arno said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arno, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive. So, eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer, with a sort of bewildered look on her face, that he was here with her all morning. So, at this point, it was clear to the officer that if the mother was telling the truth, it would officially rule out Arno as a suspect because he had a solid alibi. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis. Mothers are known to lie, cheat, and do just about anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Pettis glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside, down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Pettis, who was in charge of the investigation. It was still very early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every single step. Pettis closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and all the surrounding woods. Pettis' investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan, but there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They all claimed they had been at the house together. And so, without any real leads, Pettis had gotten so desperate for any information that he had literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Pettis sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. A moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints had actually turned up something. Pettis listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he had spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor. Apparently, there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Pettis was worried that perhaps this was just an unfounded rumor. But then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one. And her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Pettis brought his car to a stop next to a news van that was parked in the middle of the woods, about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so, Pettis had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that he was here at the crime scene, he could tell that he was late to the game because a news crew was already there, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. Pettis was disappointed to see this, because he had hoped that if and when her body was discovered dead, he would have had at least one suspect, or hopefully multiple suspects, identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now, he obviously would not get that chance. Pettis climbed out of his car and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. He went over to one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers on the ground, and Pettis introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between two tree trunks covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Pettis noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Pettis bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face. There were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Pettis noticed a couple of things that were very unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face, and so to Pettis, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Pettis think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia, and not a stranger who simply accosted her during a jog. Just then, he heard his name called, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. So, Pettis walked over, and the tech showed him what he'd found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Pettis thought that maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also on Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Pettis over to them to show him something else. They had found tire tracks in the dirt. Pettis immediately thought about that tip he had been given about this van with a person driving around town harassing women and girls. And he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved, and that these tracks had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. So, as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Pettis made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other person of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. Pettis was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. So immediately, Pettis went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing there. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering, like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out there picking mushrooms. But Pettis could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out there. And so, operating on a gut instinct, Pettis pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods, Pettis sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he had just arrested for lurking near the crime scene. And Pettis was pleased. I mean, he had only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really the first suspect who was in custody. But as soon as Pettis actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony, and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away. And he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. So, Pettis pressed Anthony to explain why he was really there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain. But what he said was, he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he hadn't been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he had just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up, and clearly there was something going on. and Anthony said he got scared and just lied and said he was out there picking mushrooms. He said it was just out of embarrassment. As Pettis sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Pettis followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he had woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Pettis their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Pettis stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So, despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Pettis had no choice but to let him go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. Hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who had been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect, since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So, the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings and his friends to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. So far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. In fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months, and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Pettis, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. Because while they had been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, the 6th of January 2018, Chief Officer Pettis was at his desk, poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head. Although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. That can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Pettis looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. A gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be that he shot himself, then put the gun in the trash can, and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head is typically immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel that distance. It just seemed very, very unlikely. So now, Pettis sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have two violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found in basically the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Pettis scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Pettis felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading. And a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck, and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. The killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up, but it was too late. She was dead. And so, now, they were really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple, but in reality, they had been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they were having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on the 28th of January 2018. And 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 25th of April 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were sitting in their police cruiser. They were parked in the lot of a public park in a city called Heilbronn in Germany. It was their lunch break. Martin was eating a sandwich, casually looking out across the park. The space was mostly empty, which made sense. It was a weekday afternoon, and most people were at work or school. Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and for the most part, it was a pretty safe place to live. The worst crimes they usually dealt with were things like break-ins or the occasional mugging. So, for Martin and his partner, it was a pretty quiet day. There wasn't a whole lot of action happening around them. But there was something that Martin, Michelle, and basically every other police officer in Germany were constantly aware of. For the past 14 years, a whole series of crimes had been happening all across the country. These crimes ranged from simple home invasions and robberies to at least 2 brutal murders. And according to the DNA evidence collected at each scene, they had all been committed by the same person. It was a single woman, and the press had given her a nickname. They called her the woman with no face. For over a decade, she had managed to evade capture. And so, in a way, every police officer in Germany was always on the lookout for her. She was the most elusive, most sought-after criminal in the entire country. But on this particular afternoon, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about the possibility of capturing the woman with no face. He was just thinking about his sandwich. He was about to take another bite when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the sound of the back doors of his cruiser opening. He whipped his head around to look, and what he saw sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. There were 2 people standing there, one at each of the open back doors, and each of them was holding a gun. Before Martin or Michelle could even process what was happening, before they could reach for their own weapons or even shout, the 2 people raised their guns. They fired. And for Martin, everything went black. Within minutes, the quiet park was swarming with police. Officers from the Heilbronn Police Department descended on the scene, their sirens cutting through the afternoon calm. They found Michelle first. She was deceased, killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. Then they saw Martin. He had also been shot in the head, but incredibly, he was still alive. He was unconscious, but breathing. An ambulance was called immediately, and paramedics rushed him to the hospital while detectives began the painstaking work of taping off the crime scene and looking for any piece of evidence they could find. Some of the officers started canvassing the area, going from bench to bench, path to path, hoping to find a witness. But it was no use. The park had been basically empty all day. There was nobody who had seen the shooting happen. Other officers got on their hands and knees, meticulously searching the ground around the police cruiser. They were looking for footprints, anything that might tell them which direction the shooters came from or where they went. They dusted the car for fingerprints, hoping for a stray print on a door handle or a window. They searched inside and outside the car for bullet casings, for hairs, for loose fibers from clothing, but there was nothing. It was as if the attackers had been ghosts. At this point, the investigators were completely stumped. All they knew for sure was that at least one shooter, maybe more, had managed to walk up to a marked police cruiser in broad daylight, completely undetected. They had opened the back doors, shot both officers in the head at point-blank range, and then vanished without leaving a single obvious trace behind. It seemed impossible. The investigators kept thinking they must have missed something. There had to be some small clue, something that could point them in the right direction, give them a lead on who was responsible for this brazen attack. In a last-ditch effort to find something, anything, at the crime scene, one of the forensic officers decided to swab the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. It was a long shot. They knew that if they found any DNA, it could easily belong to Martin or Michelle. Or it could belong to anyone else who had recently been in the back of that cruiser. It didn't mean the DNA would belong to the shooters. But it was possible. It was their only shot. They wouldn't know if the sample was useful until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that process could take a very long time. But it was worth a try. And so they carefully packaged the swabs and sent them off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come back, the Heilbronn Police Department continued to work the case. They re-interviewed everyone who worked in or lived near the park. They checked traffic cameras. They followed up on every tiny tip that came in. But they kept coming up empty. Their only real potential witness was Martin himself, but he was still in a deep coma at the hospital, unable to tell them what he saw. Weeks turned into a month. The case was growing colder by the day. And then, finally, the police got the news they had been waiting for. The DNA results from the lab were in. And what those results revealed was so stunning that it sent the media into an absolute frenzy and instantly turned this local investigation into a national manhunt. Around this same time, in mid-2007, a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Gunther Horn was sitting in his office. He got a call from his boss, and his boss's voice was urgent. He said, "The woman without a face has struck again." This time in Heilbronn. Gunther's eyes went wide. He sat up straight in his chair and listened intently as his boss laid out the details. 2 police officers had been ambushed in their cruiser. One was dead, the other in a coma. And in the back seat of their car, forensics had found DNA. The DNA of the woman with no face. Gunther had always been fascinated by this particular case. The story of the woman without a face was legendary in German law enforcement circles. And so, he was beyond ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Gunther, would be willing to lead the investigation into this latest crime in Heilbronn. His new mission was not just to solve the shooting of the 2 officers, but to finally, once and for all, identify and capture this phantom killer. Gunther immediately said yes. He would do it. And he got to work right away. The first thing Gunther did was organize a special task force to investigate the woman without a face. The team was based in Heilbronn, but their scope was national. At Gunther's command, detectives on the team began a massive undertaking. They started reinvestigating all the old crimes from all over Germany that had been linked to this woman's DNA. They were looking for patterns, for overlooked evidence, for witnesses that might have been missed during the original investigations years ago. Through this exhaustive effort, the team started to build a rough profile of their suspect. They knew she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had extensive criminal contacts. Many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But whenever police had managed to arrest and interrogate these co-conspirators, none of them would ever say a word about her. It was like they were terrified of her, loyal to her out of fear. There were a couple of other details that struck Gunther as being particularly odd. The first was the evidence itself. In 16 years of criminal activity, the only piece of evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of her dozens of crime scenes was her DNA. And since they didn't have a match for her in any database, they only knew she was a woman. They had no idea who she was. She had never left a single fingerprint. Not a footprint. Not a hair. Nothing else. It seemed like her crimes were incredibly deliberate, surgically clean, and meticulously planned. And yet, she was also consistently leaving behind her DNA. It was almost as if she was leaving it on purpose, like a calling card to taunt the police. The other strange thing Gunther and his task force discovered was that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses had described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. This was obviously weird. Based on the DNA evidence, they knew, unequivocally, that their suspect was biologically female. So Gunther had a couple of theories. Maybe this man seen at the crime scenes was just one of the woman's many co-conspirators. Or maybe the woman without a face was so cunning that she dressed as a man to avoid being identified and caught. But it was impossible to know for sure without a first-hand witness, someone who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Gunther really needed. And then, in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Gunther got a call about that exact type of witness he had been looking for. Later that same day, Gunther walked into a hospital in Heilbronn. He went to a specific room and saw police officer Martin Arnold lying in a hospital bed. His eyes were open. After being in a coma for a month, he had finally woken up. Gunter knew that Martin was his best, and maybe his only, chance of catching the woman without a face. Presumably, right before he was shot, he must have gotten a look at his attackers. He was the one witness who might finally be able to describe her. Gunter walked over, pulled up a chair next to Martin's hospital bed, and he gently asked him to please just tell him everything he remembered about what happened that day in the park. Martin was clearly distraught. He had just woken up from a coma to learn that his partner and friend, Michelle, was gone. He was emotional, trying to process his own injuries and her death, but he tried his best to help Gunter. He told him that, realistically, he couldn't remember what happened. He remembered hearing the doors open, turning around, seeing two figures. But after he was shot, it was like his memory of the event was just wiped clean. He had almost nothing to offer the investigation. And just like that, Gunter was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Gunter and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros. They clocked thousands upon thousands of hours of overtime. They even offered a massive reward equivalent to 400,000 American dollars for any information that could lead to her capture. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that while this massive investigation was going on, the woman without a face just kept committing crimes. The task force connected her DNA to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And her crimes weren't just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. The entire region was now on high alert for this woman who seemed to be an impossibly cunning international criminal genius. And Gunter, after all this time and all this effort, couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. The officer explained that the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. A badly burned body had been found, so disfigured that for a while all police knew was that the victim was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had recently come to France had been reported missing, and the police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on a hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork. That paperwork included his official fingerprints. The investigators had been able to lift a DNA profile from the ink on those prints, but when they got the DNA analyzed, the results made absolutely no sense. The French police were so baffled by what they found that they knew they had to call Gunter. They knew that if anyone in Europe needed to know about this bizarre DNA result, it was him. Gunter listened as the officer filled him in on the baffling results they had found. At first, he was just as confused as they were. But at the same time, he felt a new surge of hope. To him, it felt like, as bizarre as this new information was, maybe this was the break he had been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the clue that would finally allow him to figure out who this woman really was. He thanked the French police officer for the call and immediately brought this new information to his team. Within just a few days, this new information from France did in fact lead Gunter and his team directly to the woman with no face. It would turn out that this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across Germany and beyond, appeared to everyone who actually knew her as a completely normal person. No one would have ever suspected she was responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany. During the day, she worked at a factory. At night, she just went home. She lived a very ordinary, unremarkable life. And so, again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that the man's fingerprints on the paper somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. The man was biologically male, and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that for a fact. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman in disguise, that wasn't physically possible. And when the French police saw this impossible result, they knew they had to tell Gunter. When Gunter and his team looked into this, they finally figured out the shocking truth. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, and in particular her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police all over Europe used for DNA testing. On any given shift, this woman would touch hundreds, maybe even thousands of these swabs with her bare hands. And in doing so, she would accidentally leave microscopic traces of her own DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer. There was no brilliant female criminal mastermind parading around the country. There was just a massive, years-long contamination issue. Police had been using cotton swabs that were already contaminated with this factory worker's DNA. And so, in essence, the police had wasted nearly 2 decades of work, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime chasing a criminal who didn't even exist. It was later determined that the police officer, Martin Arnold, and his partner Michelle were not attacked by some phantom killer. They were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders and serious crimes that had been attributed to the woman without a face over the years are still unsolved to this day, primarily because the police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest and most profound embarrassments in German police history. On the afternoon of the 2nd of May 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her small farmhouse. She was in a village called Bongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the entire day working outside on her farm under the hot sun. All she wanted to do was get some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a moment. But before she could even do that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the sound of that knock actually energized her. She was almost certain that her 16-year-old son, Bak Chang-soo, had finally come home. Soo-jin and her son ran the farm together, just the 2 of them. They barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So, to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town. He also frequently picked up odd jobs around the village for extra cash. The problem was, Chang-soo would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by the farmhouse to tell his mother where he was going first. And this was 1,930 inches rural Korea. It wasn't like he could just call her on the phone. And so, this meant his mother was left to worry about him pretty frequently. And for the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin had been doing. She had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he had gone for a few days at a time in the past, working these different odd jobs, a full week was a pretty long time for him to be gone without any word. But she kept telling herself what must have happened. He must have found some good work with a family who was having him live with them full time. It was probably a great opportunity, and he had taken it. Surely he would be home soon. And now, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was. So Soo-jin rushed to the front door. She pulled it open, but the hopeful smile on her face faded immediately. It was not her son standing on the doorstep. Instead, it was 2 police officers. The first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. Soo-jin told them that she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality was, she didn't know exactly where he was, and he had been gone for the past week. But she quickly added, "Don't worry, he isn't missing. He is very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he will be home soon." But after she said this, the police officers looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces. They told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief. They explained to her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy had been performed, and it showed he had been beaten and then strangled to death. For the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people, trying to figure out who this poor boy was. And based on everything they had learned so far, Soo-jin's son, Chong-soo, was the only teenager in the entire area who wasn't accounted for. Hearing all of this, Soo-jin simply could not believe it was true. Her son was a good boy. He stayed out of trouble and worked incredibly hard. She couldn't imagine why anyone in the world would want to hurt him. So, she just told the police this has to be a mistake, but the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come with them to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the two police officers. As they led her through the entrance, down a few long hallways, and towards the morgue, she kept telling herself over and over that her son was okay. He was still alive, and this was all just some kind of horrible, horrible mistake. It had to be. But the second she walked into the cold room of the morgue and saw the body lying on the metal table, her eyes welled up with tears. Because she knew, instantly, that it was her son. To Soo-jin, this moment felt like she had left real life and stepped into a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds. He was clearly decomposing. It was an awful, traumatic thing for a mother to see. But as she stood there, staring down at a parent's worst nightmare, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, this detail about the clothes felt very, very important. She started rattling off ideas for where they could have come from. It was like her brain had suddenly fixated on this one strange detail to avoid the overwhelming trauma of losing her son. She started telling the police that maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them. Or maybe he bought them without her knowing. Or maybe, she said, whoever killed him dressed him up in these clothes for some reason. But when she said that last part out loud, it was like the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her all at once. She started shaking uncontrollably, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her quiet farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking up the path towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case. She had just been at the farmhouse, all alone, trying to make sense of his violent death. But now, seeing the officers, she went right outside to meet them. She asked them, "Do you have news for me about what happened to my son?" And they told her that she would likely want to sit down to hear this. Soo-jin figured it couldn't possibly be worse than finding out your son has been murdered. So she said, "Okay, let's go inside." They all went inside the farmhouse and sat down. And then the police told her that they had figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not one, but two people in jail right now who had both given full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Soo-jin's son, Chong-soo, had worked with Wei at the inn in town. One of them was a young man, and one was a young woman. Apparently, Chong-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was secretly planning to run away with a different man from the village. And Chong-soo had told the married man about her plan. When the woman found out that Chong-soo had exposed her secret, she was furious. So furious, in fact, that she conspired with her male coworker, the other suspect, to get revenge. They lured Chong-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then, when they got him out there, the man and the woman beat Chong-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the very first night that Chong-soo had left the farmhouse. So, over that 6-day period when his mother was worried, he was never living with another family and working for them. He was dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Soo-jin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all of this, Soo-jin still had one question. "What about my son's clothes?" she asked. Was there anything in the suspects' confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads no. They said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Soo-jin still felt deep down that the clothes had to mean something, she didn't argue. She didn't try to come up with other theories. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Soo-jin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to give him a proper burial in the local cemetery. And then, after that, she did her best to try to move on. But she never could. Every single night, she had the same terrible nightmare, replaying the moment she saw her son's body in the morgue. And as this nightmare kept happening, night after night, Soo-jin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. She basically stopped sleeping. She couldn't really eat. She certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She honestly began to think she was just going to wither away and die there unless something changed. She was overcome with grief and sadness, and she was also just plain scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then, on the night of the 18th of October, 1931, about 6 months after her son was killed, Soo-jin woke up from yet another nightmare. And when she opened her eyes, she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Soo-jin, she wasn't scared this time. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes. And she just began speaking to the figure. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Soo-jin really didn't know what she expected to happen when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have ever considered. Because suddenly, the ghost opened its mouth. And it spoke, and what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out that Chong-soo, Soo-jin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He had survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area. He was terrified that if he went back home, they would find him and finish the job. So, he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was essentially on the run. And for 6 months, he lived in random towns doing odd jobs just to survive. But eventually, after 6 months, he missed his mom. He missed his home. So he went back. And he walked into her room in the middle of the night. He was the ghost she saw at the foot of her bed. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just said to his mom, "I'm not dead." He was just being honest. He was there. He was back. He had survived. It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who, by the way, was never identified. He just happened to be in the same area where Chong-soo had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chong-soo immediately thought, "That's him. That was us." And so they confessed to killing him because that is what they had tried to do. They just didn't succeed. It was some other boy's body. And when Soo-jin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and badly bruised, and in her grief, it looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. Her intuition had fixated on his clothes, and she knew something was off. Well, she was right. It wasn't her son, and those were someone else's clothes. In the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chong-soo had their murder charges dropped because they didn't actually commit a murder. They were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, that poor boy was never identified. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and over the years, the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so, even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we are not able to exhume his body because we don't know where he is. And so, it is very likely we will never know who that person was. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. An individual by the name of Luther Charles was seated on the weathered wooden steps of his parents' front porch in St. Louis, Missouri, on a weekday morning in the month of March in the year 1995. Despite the fact that the air was cool and sharp, Luther did not detect it. His full attention was zeroed in on the newspaper that was spread out across his lap. It had been several hours since his parents had left for work, and the sound of their vehicles rolling out of the driveway was a familiar and rhythmic departure that signaled the beginning of yet another day that he would spend at home. Luther was unable to find work. 5 years had passed since he had last had a steady employment. It wasn't because he was a slacker, rather, it was because he had a simple, all-encompassing dream. Luther had a dream of becoming an actress. During the course of a half-decade, he had committed every ounce of his existence to the pursuit of this goal. Rather than only daydreaming about it, he was actively working toward achieving it. Until his own face seemed like it belonged to a stranger, he went to every audition he could find, studied monologues while he was in the shower, and practiced facial expressions in the mirror of the bathroom. On the other hand, the reality was a cruel cycle of hope followed by rejection that kept repeating itself. He would enter a casting room with his pulse hammering, perform his lines with everything he had, and then receive a courteous but forceful, "Thank you, we'll let you know." However, they never did let him know. 5 years of this had left him absolutely bankrupt, and he was still living in the bedroom he had used as a child at his parents' house. He was a grown man who was still dependent on the generosity of his parents. However, the dream itself had not diminished in any way, despite the ongoing series of setbacks. When all else was considered, it had gotten more intense and more urgent. He was aware of what his peers believed. He could hear it in the way his relatives would ask, "So, any luck with that acting thing?" He knew they saw it as a childish fantasy, a pipe dream. They were of the opinion that he ought to be practical, acquire a regular job that required him to work from 9 to 5, and acknowledge that there are certain things that simply aren't meant to be. On the other hand, Luther could not even fathom such a possibility. At that moment, the thought of abandoning up felt like a form of death. Either it was acting, or there was nothing at all. Consequently, he found himself back on this porch each and every morning, performing the same actions for the same reason. As he went through the classified section of the newspaper, he would slowly flip through it, his eyes searching for the words that would change everything: open call or auditions. While he was walking down a column of very small type on this particular morning, his gaze was drawn to something that caught his interest. It was a commercial that did not appear to be proper. The production of the musical was taking place in Ohio, which was several hundred miles away from where it was being used. From the beginning, Luther was only perplexed. There is no need for a theater company in Ohio to advertise for performers in a newspaper in St. Louis when they are located in Indiana. It was very confusing to me. As he read the text in further detail, however, he felt a surge of electricity go through his physique. In the advertisement, it was said that the producers were looking for a very specific type of actor to play a character that was described as being highly different and difficult to play. It was not an error. Rather, the advertisement was a targeted search. Additionally, as Luther read the particular criterion, he experienced a peculiar feeling of assurance that washed over him. There was more to him than merely a wonderful fit for this role. He embodied the ideal candidate. He was thinking that this might be the final solution. It's possible that this will be for him. However, he was well aware that this would not be a simple task. It was a very difficult challenge. To begin, there was the great distance between them. It was that exact night that the audition was scheduled, which meant that he would have to abandon everything, hop into his car, and drive for the entire day in order to have a brief opportunity to perform on a stage in Ohio. This brings us to the second and most significant point: the character themselves. If he wanted to provide a performance that the producers would never forget, he would have to do something drastic in order to properly embrace this part on the big screen. Considering the level of dedication that would be required, the majority of actors would not even contemplate it. Luther, however, was not like other actors. Once he had been informed that he was not good enough for 5 years, he was determined to do everything in order to prove his point. Desperation had been building up for such a long time that it had now reached a point where it had boiled over into a kind of reckless determination. Despite the fact that he was still holding the newspaper tightly in his hand, he got up from the porch and made his way back into the home. He then proceeded to stroll out to his vehicle a few minutes later. Over the course of his lengthy voyage, he was transporting 3 items with him. When he arrived at the theater in Ohio, he was accompanied by a map. In order to give him the bravery he would require, he had a whole bottle of whiskey in his possession. In addition to that, he was armed with a hacksaw to assist him in his role. During that particular evening in Ohio, a producer for the musical was seen sitting in a seat that was facing the front row of an auditorium that was otherwise empty. There were long shadows cast all across the room by the stage lights. She was really worn out. There had been a procession of hopeful actors coming and going for a number of hours, each one attempting to impress her by reading monologues, singing songs, and performing. In spite of the fact that she was aware that there was still a queue of people waiting outside in the corridor, she moaned and rubbed her temples. For the next person to enter, she yelled out for them to do so. Just a few moments later, a man made his way onto the stage by stumbling through the side curtain. The expression on the producer's face changed from one of exhaustion to one of confusion as she sat up a bit upright. As if he were intoxicated, the man was wobbly on his feet and swayed slightly from side to side. Additionally, he was dressed in a peculiar attire. He had thick, white bandages wrapped securely over his head, covering his ears and the most of his face. Both of his ears were covered. In a slurred and thick voice, he proclaimed that his name was Luther Charles. He staggered to the center of the platform, blinked into the lights, and then announced his name. He claimed that he had traveled all the way from Missouri to be considered for the role because he was aware that they were searching for a very certain type of actor, and he had made certain that he was an ideal candidate for the role. The producer was completely clueless about the subject he was discussing. She tried to urge him to clarify, to explain what he meant, but before she could get the words out, Luther began to lift his hands up to his head. She found herself unable to finish her sentence. Unwrapping the bandages was something he did in a methodical and slow manner. He yanked at the white gauze, allowing it to fall onto the stage floor in a jumbled mass due to his actions. As she watched, the producer felt a mounting sense of dread building up in her gut. It was only when the final bandage was removed, exposing the contents of the wound, that she was able to see it. Moreover, she started yelling for assistance. It would come out that the casting call that had been published in the newspaper, the one that had given Luther Charles such a powerful sense of hope, contained an error that was extremely terrible and devastating. Those who were in charge of producing the musical were looking for actors who were not just honest, but also courageous. But the advertisement that had been published in the newspaper in St. Louis contained a call for, quote, genuine earless actors. Luther Charles, who had been so consumed by his desire and so broken by 5 years of rejection, had come to the conclusion that this was his one and only chance. After driving all the way to Ohio, he had consumed a whole bottle of whiskey in an attempt to dull the pain. After that, he had committed a heinous act of self-mutilation by cutting off both of his own ears with a hacksaw. He was convinced that by making this sacrifice, he would be able to fulfill the role perfectly. Luther made it through the injuries he inflicted on himself. He received significant psychological care after being brought to the hospital, where he remained for some time. Nevertheless, he was not selected for the role. In the evening of October 2003, a woman named Tina was walking down the lengthy and narrow hallway of her apartment building in Harlem, New York. She was in the process of making her way down the corridor. While walking cautiously on the worn linoleum floor, she carried a grocery bag in one hand and moved with some caution. The walls were covered in pristine white tile, and the huge metal doors of the flats stood like sentinels on either side of the walls. The corridor was illuminated with a peculiar, pulsating glow as the fluorescent lights that were hanging above flickered in an irregular manner. Tina was confronted with a fragrance that was both recognizable and repulsive as she came to a stop in front of her own door, which resided in apartment 5D. It was coming from apartment 5E, which was right across the hall from where it arrived. It had a heavy, smelly odor that was a combination of rotting flesh and pee that had been around for a long time. Tina's expression changed to one of disdain. The only thing she wanted more than anything was to get inside her own apartment and get away from the odor. She hastily put her grocery bag down and began searching through her purse for her keys. The sound of footfall approaching from down the corridor came to her attention just as her fingers were about to close over the cool metal of her keys. As soon as she turned around, a surge of worry swept through her. Antoine Yates, the individual who resided in apartment 5E, was the person responsible for the foul odor, as it was known. As he approached her, he was carrying a large bag that appeared to be quite heavy over his shoulder. He was going directly toward her. On the surface, it appeared as though it might be filled with sand or possibly gravel. It was something that Tina had no idea what it was, and she had no desire to find out. Simply put, she was aware that she did not wish to be in any way close to him. The door was thrown open by her clumsy hands as she smashed her key into the lock, turned it, and then threw it open. To the point that she virtually dove inside, she grabbed her grocery bag from the floor, slammed the door shut behind her, and instantly threw the deadbolt. Because she had been so plainly impolite, she felt a rush of shame wash over her. Finally, Antoine had been her neighbor for a considerable amount of time. A period of time had passed when she had the impression that he was a completely decent and typical guy. However, as of late, he has undergone a shift in some aspect. He had developed an odd and peculiar demeanor, and his actions were causing her to feel extremely uneasy. The odor, which appeared to emanate from his apartment at all hours of the day and night, was the initial cause of the problem. Another factor to consider was the fact that he had turned into a complete recluse. Tina was unable to recall the last time she had saw him leave the premises for a period of time that was more than an hour all at once. There was a steady, unseen presence just a few feet away from her own front door, and it was as if he was holed up in there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. On the other hand, the noise was the most unnerving aspect. Tina would hear heavy crashing and thumping sounds coming from Antoine's flat at irregular intervals, whether it was during the day or the night. The sound was similar to that of furniture being thrown around, but as far as she could tell, he never had any guests inside his home. There was only him inside the room. Despite the fact that Tina was unaware of what he was doing, she was beginning to get the impression that whatever it was not a nice thing. Despite this, she assured herself that it was none of her business. All she could do was keep to herself, make sure that her door was always locked, and keep her fingers crossed that whatever bizarre phase Antoine was going through would ultimately pass. This was the best thing she could do. Following a couple of days, Tina made her way down to the lobby in order to retrieve her mail. During the process of organizing her letters, she came across a woman named Joyce. Joyce was a resident of apartment 4E, which was the flat that was just below Antoine's. After a brief greeting, Joyce approached Tina with a worried expression on her face and walked over to her. Tina had the ability to sense that something was awry, so she inquired about the situation. In her explanation, Joyce mentioned that she had observed liquid dripping from her ceiling the night before yesterday. Her initial assumption was that it was nothing more than a leaking pipe or even a sink from the apartment above that was overflowing. On the other hand, she discovered that it was not water when she brought a cloth to wipe it up. A powerful and pungent odor emanated from the liquid. A scent of urine was present. Joyce then softened her voice and moved closer to Tina, bringing her closer to her. She stated that the pouring was not the only peculiar thing that occurred. She went on to say that she was able to hear sounds emanating from Antoine's flat on occasion, particularly in the late hours of the night when the building was entirely silent. Not a single crash or bang could be heard. It was almost like a whimpering sound. As soon as she heard that, Tina's heart began to race. She had exerted a great deal of effort to disregard the circumstance and to simply blank it out. However, now that she was aware that another neighbor was also going through strange and unsettling occurrences, she felt as though she could no longer maintain her silence. Something more than simply an odd odor was going on here. Tina made a suggestion to Joyce that they should initiate a call to the housing authority in order to have someone come out and investigate the situation that was occurring in apartment 5E. For her part, Joyce simply shook her head. She stated that she had already attempted that at least a few times. Despite the fact that she had contacted and voiced her displeasure, there had been no action taken as of yet. A new strategy was then suggested by Tina. It is recommended that they get together with all of the other neighbors who are worried and go to the housing authority as a group. It would be impossible to disregard the complaints of a significant number of tenants, wouldn't it? I concur with Joyce that it was a good idea. Following the exchange of phone numbers between the two women, Tina made her way back to her flat, feeling a little more optimistic about the situation. The very following day, however, Tina arrived into the lobby of her building and was greeted with a scene of commotion. This occurred before she had the opportunity to speak with anyone else during the day. Unable to contain his misery, Antoine was lying on the ground. In an effort to maintain control of the situation, 2 law enforcement personnel were crouching over him. Blood was spread all over the tile floor, and Antoine had inflicted significant cuts on both his arm and his leg. The wounds were gaping and deep. Tina halted for a while, unsure about what to do, and then swiftly hurried away from the scene, indicating that she did not wish to become involved. Upstairs, she hurriedly went to her apartment and locked the door behind her. However, she was unable to contain her interest. She made a beeline for her window, which looked out onto the street, in the hopes of gaining some insight into the unexpected events that had just taken place. I watched an ambulance pull up to the curb, and she noticed it. There were a few moments later when paramedics exited from the building while pushing a stretcher that included Antoine on it. They loaded him into the back of the ambulance, and then their sirens began to sound as they rushed away. Tina watched, hoping that she would hear the police officers coming down her corridor to smash down the door of apartment 5E at any moment. She was awaiting them with great anticipation. Clearly, a violent incident had taken place, and the flat in question had to be the location of the perpetrator. She, however, waited. She waited for an hour, but she did not hear anything. The corridor remained devoid of sound. Then she peeked out her window once more and observed the 2 police officers who were stationed in the lobby walk out of the building, get into their squad vehicle, and then simply drive away. It was a shock to Tina. She was unable to comprehend all of it. There is no way that Antoine could have ever told them something that would have caused them to depart without even checking out his place. A growing sense of panic began to envelop her. What would happen if someone was harmed inside then? Imagine for a moment that Antoine had been assaulting someone and that they had finally started fighting back. Regardless of what was taking place, it was made abundantly obvious that it would never cease unless another individual raised their voice. She was aware of what she needed to do, despite the fact that it terrified her. She obtained her phone, contacted 911, and provided the dispatcher with all of the information that she was aware of regarding her neighbor who lived in Unit 5E. Tina arrived home from work the following day to discover a large crowd assembled on the pavement in front of her building. There were hundreds of people standing there, and each and every one of them was looking up at the opposite side of the structure. Tina's jaw fell as she followed their eyes and looked at them. From the roof of the building, a law enforcement officer was rappelling down the side of the structure. As he stood there, he was armed with a huge weapon and dressed in combat gear. He went slowly and cautiously, making his way down until he came to a stop, hung in the air right outside a window on the 5th level. Tina was taken aback when she became aware that he was standing at Antoine's window. The gathering remained silent as the officer began to tap on the glass, and they watched in reverent curiosity. Instantaneously, the window shattered outwards, causing pieces of glass to fall down onto the street below. Internally, it had been shattered into pieces. Instantaneously, the cop raised his firearm and fired a number of shots into the flat. Concurrently, he gave a signal to the officers who were stationed on the roof, and they immediately started dragging him up and away from the window. After a few minutes had passed, the front doors of the building suddenly opened and a half-dozen additional officers came sprinting out of the building. It was a massive and heavy tarp that they were carrying between them, and whatever was contained within it was an enormous and struggling object. Tina was very perplexed by everything that was going on until the officers passed the tarp by her. Only for a fraction of a second did she get a peek of what was contained within. It would come out that Tina and Joyce were correct in their suspicions of Antoine. Nevertheless, the reality was much more peculiar than they could have ever imagined it to be. It is not true that Antoine was a violent criminal who caused harm to individuals in his residence. Despite the fact that he was concealing a secret, it was a rather peculiar one. He had a pet of his own, a Bengal tiger named Ming that weighs 400 pounds. For a considerable amount of time, the tiger had been residing within that modest apartment in Harlem. A massive heap of sand served as its bed in one of the bedrooms of the house. It urinated all over the flat, which resulted in the odor and the leaking that Joyce had observed. Antoine also provided it with a food consisting of raw meat, which he would bring back to his house in those enormous sacks. The terrible wounds that Antoine sustained and that required him to go to the hospital were caused by Ming. It had just lately come to Antoine's attention that he had taken in a stray kitten. When the tiger attempted to attack on the much smaller cat, Antoine had intervened and ended up getting bitten in the process. It was Antoine and Ming who made it through the confrontation alive. After being taken into custody, Antoine was found guilty of reckless endangerment. After the officer on the rope had administered a tranquilizer dart to Ming, he was hauled out of the premises and subsequently transported to an animal refuge in Ohio. Ming had been hit with the dart. Furthermore, it is remarkable that the stray kitten managed to survive the attack as well. On the 6th of January, 1995, at 2:45 in the afternoon, a man called MacArthur Wheeler, who was 45 years old at the time, proceeded with intent toward the glass front doors of a bank located in Swissvale, Pennsylvania, which is a tiny town located just outside of Pittsburgh. In spite of the fact that the temperature was rather mild, he was dressed in a large blue parka and wore a simple mask that was pulled over his face. However, the mask did not completely cover his entire face. Although it was concealed within one of his pockets, his hand was resting on the icy steel of a revolver that was semi-automatic. It was about to be MacArthur's turn to rob this bank. On the other hand, there was a peculiar sense of peace that he experienced as he approached the door. Not in the least bit anxious, was he? It came as a surprise to everyone, especially considering that MacArthur had never done anything remotely like to this in his entire life. But he was not by himself. The individual that was already inside was his acquaintance, a man named Clifton Johnson, who was 43 years old. Clifton had participated in a bank robbery in the past, and he was the one who had recruited MacArthur to participate in this scheme. At this very moment, Clifton was waiting in line, acting as if he were just another client. However, in reality, he was acting as MacArthur's sidekick and lookout. In order to carry out this heist, the two men had spent several days carefully arranging every aspect of it. They were familiar with the layout of the bank, had timed the flow of customers, and had practiced each and every move they were going to make. Clifton exuded an air of serenity and self-assurance, in contrast to MacArthur, who had initially been filled with fear at the prospect. MacArthur had been taken through every conceivable scenario that could have gone wrong, and he had devised a backup plan for each and every one of each of those scenarios. The self-assurance that Clifton exuded had already made its way into MacArthur by the time this day arrived. At this point, he was very positive that their strategy was devoid of any possibility of failure and that they were going to be able to get away with it. For this reason, he did not feel anxious. Upon approaching the doors of the bank, he forced them open and proceeded to enter the establishment. Although he had to squint a little bit since his mask hindered his eyesight a little bit, he was able to locate Clifton standing in line very quickly, which was exactly what they had planned. Another boost of self-assurance came to MacArthur when he observed him in that location. Without a hitch, everything was operating. As he strolled past the queue of clients who were waiting, he went straight to the teller window that was open and made eye contact with the young woman who was working behind the counter. The revolver was pulled out of his pocket while he continued to do so. He gently instructed her to pay up all of the money while directing it directly at her to be handed over. The other individuals in the bank let out a collective gasp, which he heard them all say. As soon as they had a glimpse of what was taking place, customers and other personnel were rendered speechless, their eyes widened in terror. After a moment, MacArthur turned around and raised the rifle so that everyone could see it. He assured them that he had no intention of causing harm to anyone. Just to be calm, that was all he asked of them. As soon as he obtained the funds, he would go without a trace. Next, he refocused his attention on the teller. By this point, she had quickly retrieved all of the cash from her drawer and was in the process of holding it out with a hand that was shaking. The bundle of cash was taken by MacArthur, who then placed it into his pocket and put his revolver away somewhere else. He cast a quick glance in the direction of Clifton, who was on his way to the entrance. Both males established eye contact with one another and gave each other a slight nod. The two of them then made a U-turn and fled the bank, disappearing down the street immediately after. Roughly 3 months had passed on. The early morning hours of the 20th of April, 1995, saw MacArthur sound asleep in his apartment located just outside of Pittsburgh. He had been there for quite some time. He and Clifton had taken their booty, which was a little more than $5,000, and had promptly gone their separate ways after the robbery had been completed. The goal was to keep a low profile, stop making touch with one another, and wait for things to calm down. Everything had gone according to plan as far as MacArthur was concerned, and everything had worked out perfectly. Even though 3 months had passed, he was still a free man, and he was enjoying his portion of the money that had been taken. He had never been approached by the police, nor had they ever attempted to question him in any way. There was no danger to him. On the other hand, on this particular night, his restful sleep was disrupted by a loud and persistent beating on his front door. While he was lying in bed, he suddenly became upright as a voice called for him to open his eyes and announced that it was the cops. A surge of genuine panic came over MacArthur for the very first time since the heist had taken place. Nevertheless, he promptly made an effort to settle himself down. The advice he gave himself was to just keep his cool. Even in the event that the police believed he was involved in some manner, there was no way that they could prove anything. Their plan had been flawless all along. A mask and a massive parka that totally covered him had been worn by him at the time. His identity was safely protected. After that, MacArthur got out of bed, strolled to the door, and opened it. He took a deep breath before doing so. In the corridor, there were a number of law enforcement officers standing. The question was posed by MacArthur, who put on his most bewildered appearance and inquired about the situation. When he was notified that he was being arrested for armed robbery, one of the cops informed him of the situation. The officer then displayed a photograph to the public. The image was a still one, and it had been printed from one of the security cameras at the bank. And MacArthur's face was seen in the photograph, as plain as the sun. It was possible to make out every nuance of his appearance, from his eyes to his nose to his mouth. It could not have been anyone else but him. In point of fact, it did not appear in any way that he was wearing a mask throughout the entire photo. Despite his mind's inability to comprehend what he was seeing, MacArthur continued to stare at the photograph. This was not to be expected. His expression was a mixture of amazement and bewilderment as he looked up from the photo to the faces of the cops serving the law. Afterwards, he uttered a remark that would leave the police absolutely perplexed when they heard it. "Just now," he articulated, "but I wore the juice." In the course of the bank heist, it would be discovered that the mask that MacArthur Wheeler was wearing was not a ski mask, a Halloween mask, or any other form of mask in the conventional sense. What can only be characterized as a breathtaking leap of erroneous logic, MacArthur and his accomplice Clifton had come to believe that they had discovered a hidden way to turn invisible. This is something that can only be described as outrageous. The thing that they had done, and what they sincerely believed would fully conceal their identity from the surveillance cameras, was to put lemon juice all over their faces. As a matter of fact, they were under the notion that the acidic juice would function as a kind of invisibility cloak, rendering their faces hazy or completely invisible to electronic surveillance. Lemon juice does not, contrary to what they believe, possess the ability to render you invisible. Upon reviewing the CCTV footage of the bank, the police were presented with a high-definition, crystal-clear view of MacArthur Wheeler and Clifton Johnson committing the theft of the bank. The fact that there was such abundant evidence meant that it was just a matter of time before they were recognized and taken into custody. The role that Clifton Johnson played in the armed robbery resulted in him receiving a sentence of 5 years in jail. MacArthur Wheeler was given a sentence that was significantly more severe, which was 22.5 years. On the other hand, this odd and almost comical crime did not completely end there. In the end, a professor of social psychology at Cornell University became interested in the story of the lemon juice bandits when it was reported in the media and eventually drew his attention. After reading about the case, the professor was struck by something that had a deep impact on him. A level of stupidity that was almost impossible to grasp was suggested by the fact that MacArthur Wheeler sincerely believed that lemon juice would render him invisible and that he was so certain of this view that he used it as a basis for betting his freedom on it. Even more remarkable, however, was MacArthur's reaction of surprise when he was discovered. The fact that he was confused gave the impression that he was not only incompetent, but that he was also totally oblivious to the fact that he was failing. The professor's interest was piqued by this thought, and he accordingly started conducting research on the topic. This research finally resulted in the development of a well-known psychological theory that is now commonly referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. In essence, the effect argues that individuals who have a low capacity to perform a task have a tendency to exaggerate their own abilities. In more straightforward terms, the more terrible a person is at something, the less likely it is that they will acknowledge how incompetent they are at that particular item. At the end of the day, it's true that the more ignorant you are, the more self-assured you become. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time, what's up? On the afternoon of Saturday, the 6th of February, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lilu set up an ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a small house just outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could just make out the rich smell of beef bourguignon simmering on the stove. But Alan and the 37-year-old woman cooking the meal were not speaking to each other. The silence in the house was heavy and uncomfortable. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and this house, the one they were currently in, was a house Alan had bought for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra had started out as Alan's assistant many years ago, but over time, their relationship had evolved into something much deeper, something more like a father and a daughter. Even now, years after Alexandra had stopped working for him, they remained incredibly close. And of course, Alan had literally bought her this home to ensure she and her daughter had a stable life. As a result of this close bond, Alan found himself visiting her often, helping out around the house, doing small chores, and just being a presence in her life. He also paid for her car and for their vacations. Alan could certainly afford to be this generous. He was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a surprisingly huge business in France. Many large companies would book entire circus shows for their end-of-the-year parties for employees, and Alan had managed to secure many major lucrative contracts. His business was so successful that his main office was located in a fancy chateau in the countryside. His wife, Elizabeth, lived in a separate home, a luxury ski town near the Swiss border. Alan himself was constantly on the move, traveling all over Europe for his work. But this fast-paced life could also be a real grind. In just the past 24 hours, Alan had driven more than 1,200 miles, racing between meetings with potential clients and scouting for new circus performers. So he placed a lot of value on the quiet time he could spend at Alexandra's house. It was his escape, a place where he could recharge in the peaceful suburbs and, more importantly, spend time with someone he cared a great deal about. Now, Alan wasn't naive. He knew that his friends and his coworkers all assumed he and Alexandra were having an affair. He was almost certain that's what his own wife, Elizabeth, believed as well. And to be fair, their assumptions weren't entirely baseless. Alan was known to have plenty of extramarital relationships. He also frequently engaged with sex workers and made very little effort to hide any of it from anyone. He and his wife lived completely separate lives, and they seemed to have a silent understanding. She had her life of luxury in the mountains, and he had his freedom to do as he pleased. But Alan's relationship with Alexandra was genuinely different. It had always been platonic. They had never so much as kissed or even held hands. Alan had no children of his own, and he truly enjoyed playing the role of a father figure to Alexandra and a grandfather figure to her young daughter. But right now, they were in the middle of a big fight, and Alan was anxious to fix it. Alexandra's daughter was away for the weekend, staying with friends. So he and Alexandra had planned to have a nice, quiet dinner together this evening before Alan had to get back on the road for another business trip on Sunday afternoon. But Alan, in a moment he now deeply regretted, had somewhat stupidly brought up Alexandra's past. And what started as a simple conversation had quickly escalated into a horrible fight. They had been yelling at each other on and off ever since. Alexandra was intensely defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris full of dreams. She had fallen in love and had a baby, but the baby had tragically died. Her relationship fell apart soon after, and she had spiraled into a period of very self-destructive behavior. By the time Alan first met her back in 2002, which was 8 years before this argument in the little house, Alexandra was at a very low point. She had a 2-year-old daughter by then and was struggling immensely to provide for her. She was working a patchwork of minimum wage jobs and small side hustles, barely making ends meet. So when Alan had offered her a job as his full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. It gave her stability and a future. But deep down, there was a part of her that seemed to resent Alan's power over her more than she was grateful for his help. It was like he had total control over her well-being, her home, her car, her entire life. And she didn't always like that feeling of dependency. And so, with all that weighing on his mind, Alan left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen. He was hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could finally have a real, calm conversation. Once he was in the kitchen, he glanced over at Alexandra, who was stirring the pot on the stove, her back to him. He couldn't quite read her mood. He turned, opened the refrigerator door, and just stared inside, not really looking for anything to eat or drink. He was just biding his time, hoping she would be the first one to speak. To his immense relief, Alexandra did turn around. She playfully swung a dish towel at his arm, telling him he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad anymore. Alan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He smiled and closed the fridge door. He then suggested she come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the last load of laundry to dry so he could finish the ironing for her. A few minutes later, they were both sitting on the sofa, each with a glass of red wine. Alexandra asked Alan how his business was going. He told her it was good, which was technically true. His company was on track to bring in around $4 million that year, which is about $5 million today. But despite how things looked on paper, Alan was feeling a lot of stress. He made the vast majority of his money through those big corporate contracts. But he wasn't the only one in the game. His number one competitor was another circus owner named Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been outbidding Alan on one contract after another. It was starting to feel personal, like Michel was specifically targeting Alan's existing clients, trying to steal them away from him, rather than trying to cultivate his own business. Alan explained to Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, a city in central France, which was about a 4-hour drive south of her house. At this meeting, Alan was hoping to land a huge contract, a real game changer for the year, as long as Michel didn't swoop in and steal it out from under him again. Alexandra gently put her hand on Alan's arm and told him not to worry. She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success. She suggested they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to take care of the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alan sat by himself for a moment, just thinking. He was really looking forward to that vacation she had mentioned. In part, it was because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately. She had a new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Alan and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that things were getting pretty serious between Alexandra and Yves. They might even get married. And Alan couldn't help but worry that if that happened, Yves might eventually start to resent him for his role in Alexandra's life. He worried that Yves might see him as an overbearing figure who was a little too involved. But he decided he wasn't going to let that fear ruin the evening. As Alexandra came back into the living room with a basket of laundry, Alan picked up a book from the coffee table and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alan was back in his car, packed and ready, heading out of town for his big meeting. But what no one would realize until much, much later was that there was a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lilu's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a cup of coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up and heard the voice of Alan's longtime assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried. She was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. This was a strange call to receive. Alan was a creature of habit when it came to his work. He was not the type of person to just disappear and not tell his secretary where he was going. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. Then she asked Sylvie what was going on. And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's explanation, she felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Apparently, Alan had that very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had never shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he had a reservation for the night before. Sylvie said she had already tried reaching out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he wasn't answering the repeated calls she was making to both of his cell phones, which both appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days glued to his phones. He was always in communication with someone. She couldn't even recall a single time when he'd been unreachable, even for a few minutes. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she had called, but that she would take over from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and immediately called the police to report her husband missing. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres. Up until this point, Alan's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case. The local police in Alan's wife's hometown were handling the initial inquiry, which was pretty basic. They had made a few phone calls and filed the standard reports. But now, enough time had passed without any sign of Alan and with no new evidence coming in. The original report had been escalated to the Criminal Investigation Division. They were now considering the possibility that this could be a kidnapping, or something even worse. This young officer was now standing at this particular house because it was the last place Alan was known to have been before he vanished. The door of the home opened, and a thin, blonde woman looked out at him. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she confirmed that it was. When he explained to her that he was there as part of the investigation into Alan Lilu's disappearance, Alexandra's face immediately clouded with concern, and she invited him inside. As she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking a mental inventory of the space. The house was clean, but a bit cluttered with toys that obviously belonged to a young girl, scattered here and there. The officer scanned the room for any signs of a physical struggle or any kind of violence, things like damage to the walls or overturned furniture, but there was nothing that stood out. Nothing seemed out of place or concerning. Alexandra started asking the officer a series of anxious questions about what was going on with Alan. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? What did the police know? But the young officer just shook his head and explained that for now, they really didn't know much at all. He was just there to try to build a clear timeline of Allen's last known movements. And so, speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Allen. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to recount all the details she could recall. She explained that Allen was like a surrogate father to her and that he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had stayed with her on Friday, all day Saturday, and then had left on Sunday afternoon. He had to get on the road to drive to Vichy for his big meeting on Monday morning. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but she said that was pretty typical for them. She stressed that their relationship was not romantic in any way. It was truly platonic, and he didn't always check in with her the way a spouse or a romantic partner would. It was more like they were just really close friends. The officer nodded as he wrote down everything she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and genuinely worried, but he was still suspicious of the idea that she and Allen were not romantically involved. It just seemed unlikely given the circumstances. So, before he left, he asked if he could see the rest of her house. He was doing this in part just to gauge her reaction. If she said no or got defensive, he would know to probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed without any hesitation. And she gave him a full tour, taking him all around the house and showing him any room he wanted to see. What he found was that the rest of the house seemed just as normal and unremarkable as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the front door and promised him that she would call immediately if Allen reached out to her. And so, after leaving Alexandra's house, the officer, wanting to be thorough, went door to door up and down Alexandra's street. He asked her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend, trying to see if anything they said contradicted Alexandra's story. But everyone he spoke to more or less confirmed what she had told him. Allen was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question. They all said that nothing had seemed off or unusual at all. So, eventually, the officer left and went back to the station. When he got there, he wrote up his report highlighting Allen's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Allen's wife lived, continued to follow up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Allen's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions. Everything showed no activity at all after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and all of his friends, but no one had heard anything. They even put in an official request to the car company, Audi, for the GPS data that was stored in Allen's car, which was a large Audi Q7 SUV. The investigators knew it was entirely possible that Allen had chosen to disappear. He was very wealthy, he had lots of connections all over Europe. It was a possibility that he had simply decided to walk away from his life. And if that was the case, it would be incredibly difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so whether Allen's disappearance was voluntary, an accident, or the result of foul play, the police knew that finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even begin looking for Allen. On the 26th of February 2010, 19 days since Allen had been reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orléans, France, looking at Allen's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that the police had requested from Audi had finally come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising location. Again, the last place where Allen was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicolas, near Chartres, and supposedly heading to Vichy for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or in Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered abandoned in the parking lot of a train station in Orléans, which was a city roughly in between those two other cities. And so, to the police, it looked like he had gotten about halfway to his destination and then just stopped for some reason. When they had first located the car, the first thing they did was set up a surveillance team to watch it for 2 full days. They wanted to see if maybe Allen or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where the car was found was in a pretty rough part of town, an area where violent crime and sex work were common. So it was possible that any number of people could potentially approach the car or try to break into it. It just seemed like a seedy enough area where if they watched it long enough, something might happen. But after 2 days, nobody had shown up. So, finally, they just had the car towed to the impound lot so that forensic technicians could process it and look for any evidence. And Detective Martin was here to personally oversee that process. The forensic techs began to circle the vehicle, taking photos of the outside from every angle and carefully dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the exterior of the car, and there were no signs of any attempt to break into it. Plus, when they looked through the windows, they could see Alan's briefcase and his luggage were still sitting inside the car. This meant that the car being found where it was likely not the result of a simple car theft. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car for a joyride and then dumped it. It seemed like how this car got here was directly connected to what had happened to Alan. And as he followed that line of thinking, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Alan probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians finally opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery and the dashboard were disappointingly clean. There was nothing there. This didn't exactly support the idea that foul play had occurred inside the car. It just deepened the mystery. But after a few more minutes of thoroughly scanning the interior of the car, one of the technicians pushed a button near the driver's side door that electronically opened the trunk. After the trunk lid lifted open, Detective Martin walked around to the back of the SUV to look inside. And what he saw was a bulky object wrapped completely in a pink bedsheet. And right away, Martin had a sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and carefully pulled the sheet back. And almost immediately, Martin's worst suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body. It was a man's body, fully clothed and curled up in the fetal position. There was no doubt in his mind that this was Alan Lilu. But there was no visible blood, no wounds, and no bruises anywhere on his body. And there was no blood in the trunk itself. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Alan's body to examine him further, he found that his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner on the scene told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she conducted the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been very cold, which was actually good for evidence collection because it basically meant the trunk had acted like a refrigerator, preserving Alan's soft tissues. As the coroner wheeled the body away on a gurney, Martin just stood there, staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Alan had died. All he knew for certain was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got straight to work. Since Alan's body was found in Orleans, the jurisdiction for the case fell to him, and he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and all the other evidence that had already been gathered by the other police departments. And right away, the picture these files painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with a lot of potential suspects and multiple locations to consider. Alan was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orleans where his body had ended up. In fact, it seemed he rarely spent more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, his life seemed to be a constant balancing act between his office, a series of hotels, with frequent stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to the reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she had confirmed that Alan was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so, this made her the last known person to see Alan alive, which, in Martin's mind, automatically made her a person of interest. However, Alexandra's story about Alan leaving her house on Sunday, February 7th, seemed to match up perfectly with the data Martin had from Alan's car, his cell phone, and his credit card records. All of those records showed that Alan really did leave her house and travel to Orleans on that day, and then, for reasons that were still unknown, all communication and all financial activity just stopped. It seemed very likely that was the day he was killed. Right from the beginning, just like the young police officer who had originally visited Alexandra and taken her statement, Detective Martin found it very hard to believe that her relationship with Alan was not romantic. It just seemed, based on how frequently they saw each other and the fact that Alan was buying her major things like a house and a car and paying for vacations, that there had to be more to the story than what they were being told. But even though that cast a certain level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just the logical side of the situation for Detective Martin. The size difference between Alan and Alexandra was significant. Alan was a big guy. He weighed about 240 pounds. And Alexandra was very small and petite. Now, was it impossible for her to kill him, lift his body into the trunk of his car, and dump it in Orleans? No, it wasn't impossible. But it just seemed very unlikely. And so that idea was just sort of floating in the back of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Alan's business associates and his wife had provided. First off, Alan apparently had a lot of affairs with a lot of different women. And so, that meant that every single one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners connected to them, were also potential suspects. It also meant that Alan's wife, Elizabeth, had a very clear motive to want her husband dead. Basically, he was openly cheating on her all the time. That had to be a powerful motivation for her to want him gone. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth would have literally done the killing herself because her phone records and other evidence showed she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband was likely killed. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman to do it for her. And the second thing that Detective Martin learned from the business associates and from Alan's wife was that Alan's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Alan's employees and his colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless businessman. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was always flying around. And so, because Martin had been handed this murder investigation with an overwhelming number of potential suspects, instead of just being paralyzed by where to even start, Martin assembled a team of his very best deputies. And they set to work, meticulously re-interviewing every single person connected to Alan, and, from those interviews, making a new, prioritized list of suspects. 3 weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station. He sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and seemed very calm. The man's name was Michel de la Rue, and he was Alan's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anyone else's. And this was because immediately after Alan had disappeared, Michel had started aggressively contacting all of Alan's clients, trying to get them to sign new contracts with his company instead. It was a pretty cutthroat and cold-hearted thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on the value of these contracts Michel was going after. They added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which, in the detective's mind, was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel had killed Alan specifically to absorb his business. And not only that, but the coroner had, by this point, come back with Alan's official cause of death. He had been strangled, likely using some kind of ligature like a rope or a belt. And the coroner estimated that it likely took between 5 to maybe even 10 minutes for Alan to actually die. That meant that someone had been actively strangling him for a very long time. That is a long, physically demanding time to be right on top of somebody, killing them. And there were also some scratches found on Alan's legs, which suggested that his body had been lifted and dragged into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, had clearly taken place somewhere else outside of the car, and all of that meant that whoever killed Alan had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michelle now, Detective Martin thought that he certainly fit that description. He seemed like a fit, strong man. However, as Martin began asking Michelle questions and watching his face and his body language for any signs of anxiety or defensiveness that might suggest he was hiding something, what he found was that Michelle seemed completely open and very straightforward. He acted like he had nothing to hide. Michelle immediately acknowledged that he had been trying to poach Alan's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. He said that was just business. He said he was sure that if their positions had been reversed, Alan would have done the exact same thing to him. And besides, he said, he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Alan had been killed, Michelle had been hundreds of miles away on a ski trip. And then Michelle produced a folder that was full of receipts and a list of phone numbers of people who could verify his story. He handed it over to Martin, who took it. He told Michelle to sit tight. Then, the detective got up and left the interrogation room. He handed the folder over to another detective and told him to start checking everything out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to go in and take a shot at questioning Michelle. The idea was to create a sort of good cop, bad cop dynamic to see if maybe a new face and a new approach would rattle Michelle. And so, Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and tried to break Michelle's story. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So, Martin signaled for yet another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a very run-of-the-mill conversation with Michelle and made no progress at all. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michelle in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around, and it was one of his deputies. The deputy told Martin that, unfortunately, he had called all the people on Michelle's list, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had even spoken to the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michelle's alibi was solid. It had checked out completely. He clearly could not have physically been able to kill Alan. He was verifiably at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he couldn't just keep Michelle there indefinitely, just hoping to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some remote possibility he was involved, there just wasn't enough evidence to hold him. And so, he had to let Michelle go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk, combing through the case files again, when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was someone at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. This was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local newspapers, basically saying, "Hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me." And he was hoping that whoever this person was potentially that witness. And so, Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby. And there, he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was a man who appeared to be in his early 50s, and he was dressed all in black, with shiny black shoes and dark glasses. Martin wondered if maybe this was another one of Alan's business contacts. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then, this man introduced himself. And when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. The man said his name was Remy Seren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even wasting his time by bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy, "Thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this, you need to go." But then he thought better of it. The truth was, Martin was having absolutely no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car. There were no usable fingerprints. And while the pink bedsheet that Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their criminal database. And then, the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either. And he'd found no evidence at all that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles had taken out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter, Alexandra, and all the women he was having affairs with, and even all the sex workers they could find who he had engaged with. and none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made any sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little bit of curiosity and a whole lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy, the psychic, back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought he knew. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving in his car. And when he heard the story, he had a vision that was so vivid and so powerful that he actually had to pull over to the side of the road. He said he saw Alan Lilu as clear as day, locked in a physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her face, but he was certain that a woman was somehow directly involved in Alan's murder. At first, Martin was disappointed. Unsurprisingly, this just felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody pretending to be a psychic, someone who claimed they could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw out this random generic idea as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say that he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orléans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and placed in the trunk of the car after he was already dead. And this immediately caught Martin's attention. Because the coroner had been certain that Alan was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transport, but critically, the police had not released that specific piece of information to the press. They had held it back specifically so they could weed out fake tips and false confessions. And so, for Remy to say that, how would he have known that detail? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy. But it just seemed so specific, so on the nose, that he began to reconsider what else Remy had said. This idea that Alan was struggling with a woman, that was something that Martin had not really considered seriously. He had sort of ruled most women out as the primary suspect because of how big Alan had been and how physical and brutal this murder had to have been. It just seemed much more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly, it seemed entirely possible that maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk because he had an idea. Lots of people in Alan's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alan had had many extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had already spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alan, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alan's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Alan's car had been parked was pretty sketchy. It was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew that Alan engaged with sex workers. That was one of the things he did. And they had spoken to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as suspects. And so, for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as a primary suspect pool. However, now, with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Alan was in Orleans in the first place was because he was there to meet a sex worker. And while he was there, something went terribly wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Alan's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Alan's emails and his business records. But Martin was looking for something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Alan had found sex workers to visit. Basically, what he was doing was making a new, truly exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever engaged with online. This was a much bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through. And as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to track down and speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Alan was engaging with had any connection to the city of Orléans. And they also did not appear to have any real issues with Alan himself, at least not based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came across one new profile. This woman was named Marie Eve. And when he took in who this woman was, and saw her picture, and read her information, he knew right then and there that he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a full confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Alan Lilu on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Alan, and inside they were burning with a white-hot rage. Alan seemed to think he was so much better than the killer just because he was this powerful businessman, and the killer was, in his eyes, just a sex worker. The killer had tolerated Alan's condescending behavior for a long time because Alan had money and power. But now, Alan had pushed it too far. The killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Alan's own belt lay on a nearby chair. And impulsively, the killer grabbed it. They lunged forward and looped the leather belt around Alan's throat from behind. At first, Alan struggled. He reached up with his large hands, trying to pull the belt off. He had no idea what was happening, but the killer just held on tight, pulling with all their might. And for several agonizing minutes, there was this unbelievable death struggle going on in the quiet house. And Alan, he was fighting for his life. He was a big guy, and he was getting close to pulling the belt free. But then, something unbelievable happened. The killer had braced themselves against the ironing board that was set up behind them. And so, with their back pressed up against it, they were pulling as hard as they could with the belt against Alan's throat. And as they were leaning back with all their weight, the ironing board they were braced against suddenly broke. The legs buckled. And because the killer didn't let go of the belt and was applying maximum pressure, when they fell backwards, it created a violent whiplash effect. Their body tumbled to the floor, and all of that force was driven instantly into Alan's throat. That sudden, violent jerk crushed Alan's larynx, and he immediately went still. And so, just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Alan was dead. And when Alan did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, their heart pounding, just taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of the body. This was a huge man. How were they going to get rid of it on their own? So, the killer called their accomplice. The accomplice was hundreds of miles away at a ski resort, but they immediately told the killer to wait and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived. And together, they helped the killer load Alan's body into the trunk of Alan's own car. Then, the killer climbed into the driver's seat of Alan's car and drove it to the train station in Orléans. And following behind them as they made this grim journey was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Alan's car and his body in that rough part of Orléans, and then together they would drive away in the second car. Shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Alan's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola. And Alexandra's troubled past that she was so defensive about included the fact that she was a sex worker who used the online name Marie Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Alan had fought previously about her troubled history. She was especially mad that at one point Alan had implied that Alexandra's daughter could end up just like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on that Saturday, February 6th, when Alan brought up Alexandra's daughter again, just in conversation, something inside of Alexandra snapped. It just felt so deeply disrespectful that he was once again talking about her daughter in that way, and out of pure impulse, she had grabbed his belt, wrapped it around his neck, strangled him, and then, in that freak accident, stumbled backwards, crushing his larynx and killing him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her. Alan had left her house in his car on February 7th, and she had not seen him again. What she had conveniently left out was that Alan was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nicola confessed to the murder of Alan Lilu and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for the concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released from prison, and together, they have a child who was born before Alexandra began her sentence. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.